Hi, this is Brian Russell. I want to welcome you back to class and talk a little bit about your work from last week and answer some of the questions in the forum. First, we're going to talk about survey methodology and some of the questions that came up. There's a common question about the difference between causation and instrumentation. Now, you have a couple different options. If you go back and look at the video on how to do a survey, when I walk through all the structural relationships, you want to notice that there's several structural relationships that are related in terms of causation. And that would be causation itself, the flip of causation, which is substantiation. So causation moves from cause to effect. Substantiation moves from effect to cause. So like for causation, this is true, therefore do this, therefore this is true. Substantiation, think of Matthew 4:17, repent, that's the imperative, because the kingdom of heaven is at hand. So there's effect, cause. Now, a more subtle form of causation can be when you have a question which then leads to an answer, or a problem that leads to a solution. That's a structure. But then there's also instrumentation. In particular, I want to focus on the difference between moving from cause to effect and moving from what instrumentation is, from means to an end, or simply a statement of purpose. Again, we're talking about moving towards a desired end. Causation, most properly, is slightly less precise than instrumentation, because instrumentation presumes that you're targeting a desired end, right? With the idea of intentionality or purpose in there. And so there's two types of instrumentation that we can see in inductive Bible study. The first is a flat out statement of purpose. These don't happen quite as often, but again, the textbook example would be the end of John's gospel, where John is talking about the end of chapter 20, where he's talking about, I write these things so that you may believe certain things about Jesus, right? So you just have the explicit statement, purpose statement. Now, what we saw in the survey of 118 to 223 in Matthew is I suggested that the action move forward by instrumentation, or probably even more precisely, a recurrence of instrumentation, where you have essentially several features. You have the scriptural quotations that are showing that that's the means towards the end, which is the fulfillment of these scriptures. You have dreams, again, revelation leading to the moving forward of God's mission. And so you have these features that work as, and also the appearances of angels, right? So you have dreams, the angel, scripture as means to an end. And now that's different from pure cause and effect, simply because instrumentation, again, has that element of intentionality in it. Now, if you can't make precisely the difference between those two things, that's okay. Again, the key thing with any structural relationship, and in a sense this leads to that second question, the key to any structural relationship is describing what it is that you see. It's more important that you see how the features of a text, how the data in a text works together, than it is just to get the correct label, right? And so make sure, like if you're not sure if it's causation or instrumentation, that's okay. So what if you name, instead of means to an end, you label it cause and effect? You're still seeing the same thing, right? So we're just talking about precision and labeling in some ways. It's more important long term for your interpretations of the passage is to be able to actually see that there's actually these structures that are organized in the material. So when you're describing your major structures, don't just use a label, break it down. If you say causation, you should say something about what you see as the cause briefly, and then what you see as the effect briefly. Again, you're going to hash the rest of that out when we get to an interpretation, which we haven't done yet. So you're making the observation, the structural observation. I see causation working here, or I see instrumentation, giving it some description. Observe what my surveys look like. Again, there's not a lot of data there, but there's enough that if you've read the text, you can follow along. So that's what you want to make sure. Can your reader, like me, can I understand what you think you're describing? Or you can even ask yourself, if you'd come back and pick up your sheet a year from now, would you know what you were talking about? So when the answers to those questions are yes, you know that you've described with enough detail. Okay, then there's the perennial question every time: what if my survey does not match the professor's work? Well, what if? My work is to illustrate what's possible. It represents my best understanding of the passage. Now, sometimes I change my mind, and I have even recently on the survey we just turned in. I sometimes get new insights from you, the students, and so it doesn't really matter to many ways if your work matches mine. I'm looking for, does your work, is it competent? Does it make sense? Are you following the procedures? Are you discerning between major structures and minor structures? Now, we should have some agreements, but you shouldn't base the correctness of your own work against to the extent to which it matches up with mine. Now, I hope that yours matches mine in some ways, but the key thing is, can you follow what I'm doing after you read it? If you're totally lost when you look at my stuff, that might be a problem. But if you can follow along, you're okay. I remember sitting in David Bauer's class back in 1991, and you know what? I wanted my stuff to look like his every single week. But you know what? It barely ever did. And you know what? I still got a pretty good grade. So, you're not graded on whether or not it matches mine. You're graded on your application of method. And again, for the first part of the term, I'm not giving letter grades simply because you need to not work for a grade. You need to work to learn the method. If you learn the method well, do the feedback, and provide substantive work, you're going to get exactly what you want. But you need to release yourself and not be afraid to be wrong right now so that you can learn how to do it correctly. So don't worry about, as long as you're doing the work, you're going to be okay. Now, the other thing is, what counts as a major impression? Again, it's a catch-all, and you can essentially put whatever you want in there. If you have minor structures and you want to remember something that you know is not major, put it there. If you have some interpretive hunches, perhaps, but you're not to do a bunch of interpretation there. You can note pretty much anything that you observe that you couldn't fit into some other part of your survey that you think you might want to remember if you were to go on and do interpretation. Okay, a couple comments on 118 to 223 in general. There's been some conversation about that relationship between what I called Unit 1 and Unit 2. And again, there are different ways of structuring, and some of you may have had multiple units. For various reasons, I try to talk about that in the video on my survey. I just keep it simple. Unit 118 to 25 seems to go together. 1 to 23 seems to go together, so I had to organize it that way. But what's the relationship? Now, some of you noted that there is a pivot inside of 118 to 25. I put some comments on that in the discussion forum, but that's not a major structure because the pivot doesn't extend into the next section per se. The pivot actually is in 118 to 25 itself, as well as the climax that comes off of that pivot, which is the naming of Jesus. I think a better way to think about the relationship between these two units would be a couple of things. I think Unit 1 is essentially introductory. It lays out the events, which is Jesus' birth, which is the setup for what happens next. Maybe perhaps if you think it's a little stronger, that could be cause and effect between those two pieces. You also have some of the recurrences that connect over top of this, and also that instrumentation. So those would be the ways that you see these units being connected. Now, Joseph's role also is critical when you read these. And I often ask, how is Joseph characterized? What Old Testament character reminds you of Joseph? And in some level, the answer is Joseph, especially in that first chapter. He's kind of this unsung hero who is faithful and righteous. And in Unit 2, he's essentially one of the heroes, along with the Magi, in terms of how God advances the action. We also have the role of outsiders, especially the Magi. Isn't it astonishing that the Magi, who are essentially astrologers, come to Jerusalem with revelation about the birth of the Messiah that actually caused King Herod, but then very subtly, all Jerusalem with him, including the Bible scholars, to be disturbed. So outsiders have insights that the insiders didn't have. So you have this nice play that we'll see within the Gospel of Matthew. Now, if you're interested in this particular topic, I've actually posted a long essay, well, not a long essay, it's about 2,000 words in our forum that you can read what we can learn from the insiders and outsiders in this text, Matthew 2, 1-12, that deals with the Magi. But you want to notice that the first worshipers of the Messiah are actually these pagan astrologers. Again, one of Jesus' names back in 1:18-25 is he will be named Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. So the question is, who is Jesus' people? Now, Matthew's gospel is going to push God's people, the church that Matthew's writing to expand their notion of who God's people is. And I would suggest that remains a key element for all of us as we think to advance the Christ-following mission in our day. Who has Jesus come to save? And what would that look like for our communities of faith to not thwart God's mission by thinking that outsiders are incapable of becoming insiders? One of the other things that shows up in this text is the passive role of Jesus. Again, we have high hopes for Jesus, even from the end of the genealogy. We know he's the Messiah. We kind of know what's going to happen as we're reading this. But isn't it interesting in this section here on his infancy that Jesus is essentially a prop? He's just the child. Did you notice that language over and over again? The child, the child, the child. Jesus is acted upon rather than being the actor. And God's mission is advanced through faithfulness of the persons who have Jesus in their care. Most profoundly, notes the Magi successfully helped Jesus, again, outsiders, and then Joseph, who's kind of an outsider himself, though he is in the Davidic line. But it's interesting that Joseph, his character, and he's going to recede from the background, but Joseph serves his role well because he protects the child in his most vulnerable state. Anyway, those are a few comments for this week. If you have other ones, continue to post them in our discussion forum. I look forward to reading your outstanding work as you develop it. If I can help you in any way, let me know. I'm Brian Russell, and it's my privilege to serve as your professor this semester.